Good afternoon. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I'm the Associate Director of Library and Museum Programming at the American Philosophical Society. Welcome to the final day of the APS's virtual symposium, The Promises and Pitfalls of Citizen Science. I'm glad that so many of you have been able to join us today. The American Philosophical Society resides in Lenape-Hoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. The APS acknowledges with respect their continued presence and perseverance, and expresses its sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of numerous Indigenous communities and individuals who've offered their guidance, their expertise, and opportunities for collaboration. This week's conference is inspired by the Society's 2021 exhibition, Dr. Franklin, Citizen Scientist, and expands on the exhibition's themes by exploring understandings of citizen science over time, placing historical initiatives in conversation with present-day projects, as well as reflecting on the future needs and opportunities of the movement. For those of you who are familiar with the APS, welcome back. For those joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. The Society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who've made exceptionally significant contributions to science, arts and humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing over $1.5 million in research grants a year, primarily to younger scholars who need the support the most. Our library and museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. Please check out our website, amphilsoc.org, and we'll put that link in the chat box to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. We are using Zoom webinar today, so not to worry, you have all been muted. You are not going to accidentally interrupt our presentation. If you have a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom center of your navigation bar. You might take a minute now and just go ahead and locate it. You can ask a question, type a question in there at any time. There will be time at the end of the panel for questions with our speakers today. We also encourage you to keep the conversation going on the APS's social media using the hashtag #CitSciAPS. And again, you can see it on screen. We'll also put it in the chat box. Papers from today's speakers are available for download from the conference website and may be accessed using the passcode CitSci2021. We'll put a link to that as well. There's some wonderful papers in there. I encourage you, if you haven't had a chance to read the papers yet, to go ahead and download them and look more in depth at the subjects we're covering. We are excited to offer closed captioning for this conference. If you'd like to use it during the panel, please click on the CC box on the bottom navigation bar of Zoom. It's right to the right of the Q&A button. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce the presenters for today's panel on the pitfalls of citizen science. We started the week with the promise, we're ending with the pitfalls. Darcie DeAngelo is an anthropologist who works on human-non-human relations. She is dedicated to engaged work and has produced films and policy work from her research on Cambodian deminers who work with landmine detection rats. She is currently a Charles E. Scheidt postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention at SUNY Binghamton and will be an assistant professor of sociocultural anthropology at the University of Oklahoma starting in fall 2021. Maxime Polleri studies the guidance of risk and recovery in the aftermath of disasters and public health crises. He is currently a postdoctoral researcher at McGill University in the Biomedical Ethics Unit within the Faculty of Medicine. He is also a network affiliate at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University, where he was previously a MacArthur Nuclear Security pre- and postdoctoral fellow. Kaitlin Whitney is an assistant professor in the Science, Technology, and Society Department at the Rochester Institute of Technology. They graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2016 with a PhD in zoology and a minor in STS. Excuse me. Part of their research program is focused on ableism and inaccessibility as barriers to open science. Dr. Whitney is hearing and lives in a bilingual American Sign Language and English household. Each of the speakers is going to give their paper in the order that I've just laid out, and then we will all come back together for question and answer at the end. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. DeAngelo.
Thank you so much for that, that introduction, and thanks so much to the organizers for setting this conference up. I really have enjoyed all the papers so far. I do want to preface this presentation first by saying that I am an anthropologist, so this idea of the excess data that I'm going to talk about in this presentation and the kind of pitfalls, the so-called pitfalls that we talk about, this is what anthropologists study. So this is maybe why I'm aware of the kind of human subjects concerns when it comes to thinking about citizen scientists. So first, can we go to the Q slide, please? So first, I want to introduce the project. So I started studying a citizen science lab, which was North Carolina State University's Rob Dunn Lab, which has recently been renamed as the Public Science Lab, which explores microbiomes and other kinds of wildlife in people's homes. So these experiments involve crowdsourced data where citizen scientists track their cats with GPS. As you can see in this figure, it's a map of a tracked cat called Chicha, and or where people, citizen scientists, send microbial samples from their shower curtains, shower heads, their belly buttons, their underarms, and their homemade sourdough starters. And that's all under a project called Your Wildlife. And there are three projects here that I'm going to outline here, where the sourdough projects, the cat tracker, and Never Home Alone. The experiments themselves have a wide appeal, but even more so during the pandemic, when more and more people isolated and began doing things like baking sourdough bread. The lab's primary goal in its projects is to collect data on what it calls the wildlife of homes. In its sourdough project in particular, the lab scientists analyzed the genetic sequences of the microbial communities of people's sourdough cultures as a means to understand the multiple yeast species and bacteria that live in the air of people's homes. They also track the migration of these yeasts, since sourdough starters are often inherited from family members. So the lab scientists call their participants who send in samples of wildlife citizen scientists, which we can define by this long history of volunteers, usually non-professional scientists, who participate in scientific projects. The lab asks citizen scientists to track the descriptions of the sourdough starters as well. So once you make a sourdough starter, you end up sending in information about your sourdough starter, such as the smell, the color, the taste of the bread it produces, etc. So it's not just the genetic sequence that they're collecting. What this data collection ends up doing in its survey form is provoking unexpected results from testimonies of citizen scientists. And this means that they ended up with a lot of excess data. So if you could go to the next slide, please. And what this excess data produced was what the lab scientists called a practice of care between the lab scientist and the citizen scientist. So when we first sent in the surveys, a lab scientist told me in an interview over the phone, our study of sourdough wasn't to study the people. That wasn't the intention. At the end of the survey, there were some more open-ended questions, and then there was so much data, so many paragraphs. So the lab scientist here is describing what the surveys produced from the citizen scientist. And the citizen scientist not only described their sourdough starter, where it came from, but also these long personal stories about the sourdough. And they described this as finding out information as if it was a personal family member or a pet. The lab scientists also found this a very unexpected, intimate conversation that they ended up having with their citizen scientists. So and while this was sort of expected for the cat tracker, so again, there's this cat tracker project where you attach a GPS to your cat, and then you provide that data to the lab scientist, and then they try to figure out what is a cat's behavioral practices when it comes to kind of domestic wildlife. And what that ends up doing is you end up having long conversations with the citizen scientist as well. So the lab scientist would be on the phone with the citizen scientist about their cat, about the data results, and what it meant about their cat. So you would have the lab scientists described these conversations as a practice of care, but it was really unexpected for them to have that practice of care with the sourdough starter project as well, which to me indicates actually that there's a lot of unexpected excess data when it comes to citizen scientists, especially when it comes to crowdsource data. So when you have this kind of result, the lab scientists decided they needed to revise their IRB to better collect this data, and they also decided to hire a historian. So they didn't just have a bunch of people who studied ecology or people who studied genetic sequences. Instead, they decided to expand their project to include environmental humanities by hiring an historian of agricultural science. So you have here this excess data resulted in different practices when it comes to the lab's experiments. The historian explained it to me like this. For the lab, the easy part was the DNA sampling, the seeing where clusters of bacteria that cluster around the sourdough. It's an evolutionary genetic project. But they realized they needed someone weird. So in phase 2 of the project, we just tacked on some more super groovy questions. Does your sourdough starter have a name, etc.? So this second phase of the sourdough starter inspired the scientists to employ the historian for new questions, but also to collect this excess data in a more purposefully. This changed the whole experiment itself, and then created these unexpected intimacies between citizen and lab scientist. So if we can go to the next slide. Just an overview of institutional review boards. They're meant to protect potential harms that come to participants within a scientific study. And they've been designed with experimental science in mind. When humans become scientific subjects, they must be protected. This is something that anthropologists have always kind of come up against anyways, because anthropologists, when they collect qualitative data, they're being assessed as if they're doing an RCT trial with experimental drugs. But therefore, though, the IRB also doesn't predict the intimacies that get produced by the data collection, nor can it encompass the ethical imperatives that such intimacies structure. There's an ethical imperative to give back, to have a practice of care when it comes to the intimacy between a citizen scientist and a lab scientist, or in the case of anthropology, between an anthropologist and an interlocutor, someone you collect data from. So take the lab scientist's insistence that correspondence with the citizen scientist became an act of care. Even in a revised ethical application, the IRB cannot capture the necessary emotional work of what lab scientists described as hour-long conversations and lots of email exchanges that probably took hours to write. Moreover, the excess data that they were excited to receive because of the connections they felt with the citizen scientists revealed new overlaps between their own stories and the stories from citizen scientists. So stories of sourdough starters are just saturated with intimacies, resulting in blurred boundaries between the citizen scientist and the lab scientist. So you have the sourdough starter being a practice that both lab scientists and citizen scientists take on, and then having conversations about their sourdough starter as if it's a being that's part of their family. So, or it sometimes does represent, it has an indexical relationship to relatives who passed along the sourdough starter. People were really excited about getting special sourdough starters or having special sourdough starters, meaning that, you know, there's you feel like your sourdough bread is like the most delicious bread because of the way that your starter collects different microbes. And we can talk more about how sourdough itself works, but there's a lot of expectation that citizen scientists would feel like, okay, my sourdough starter is so great, and lab scientists would have that same kind of expectation. And then sometimes you end up analyzing the results, and then you find out the genetic sequences are just the same as any sourdough and actually not that different. So then there's a kind of disappointment and results in like long kind of emotional conversations about that. Very similar to the cat stories, where the cats would be kind of boring and not travel a lot, and therefore were disappointing to to the owners who really wanted their cat to be unique. And so you had this kind of space that needed to open for care and connection between the citizen scientists and the lab scientists. the other thing is that the sourdough starter itself has a kind of personification for most of these people, including the lab scientists. So the lab scientists and citizen scientists, when talking about the subjects of their science, end up kind of personifying them, anthropomorphizing them, talking about the sourdough starter as if it can speak back to them. And so it's interesting to kind of think about that as excess data as well, this kind of emotional relation and attachment to the sourdough starter. So here's a quote from one of the citizen scientists saying, "There's a real emotional attachment that's important to me. I don't know if it has a mind or if it's sentient, but I know it's alive and I hope it knows I'm grateful to it. I heard that if you listen to the starter, it sings to you. And I tried it once. I turned off all the noises in my house and bent down close to it, and I listened to it and I heard him." This kind of quote shows you a kind of move for citizen scientists to feel really personally attached to their sourdough starters, but that actually works in conjunction with the lab scientists too. So what ends up being created through these conversations are ways of creating personalities of the sourdough starters, and the whole kind of culture of the lab became about making sourdough starters into beings. If you could go to the next slide, please. But what this doesn't take into account is actually the accidental surveillance that occurs with sourdough starters. So I'm sort of skipping over a little bit in the interest of time, but in the sourdough lab has ended up creating 2 different Facebook groups and social media groups. And those Facebook groups are basically crowdsourced communities that involve both lab scientists and citizen scientists talking about the starters as if they're people. So those kinds of overlaps occur, and then the crowdsourcing becomes a way of crowdsourcing personalities into being about these sourdough starters. So sometimes naming your starter being an explicit part of taking care of it, including in the steps for baking, and included in the steps for analyzing and collecting data. So with the citizen science lab actually says, you should actually pay attention to your starter, make sure you feed it when it's hungry, things like that. It might be grouchy if you smell that kind of alcohol smell, that's called hooch, and that means it's kind of grouchy and hungry. So this kind of a personification occurs, creating a kind of overlap between citizen scientists and scientists. But actually, this doesn't take into account the disparity in the research between the lab scientists and the citizen scientists. And only one has their excess data permanently captured. So some of this excess data makes its way into public-facing outcomes of the research. For example, one lab scientist brought his family sourdough to a conference and had bakers bake it in different ways and have a taste test, but that lab scientist excess data remains part of a continuous consensual process. Your wildlife actually captures citizen scientists' home locations on a GPS map. So like the cat tracker shows you, you can basically approximate where the citizen scientists' houses are, basically by just finding out where the cats are traveling around. And you see here, there's another Your Wildlife project called Never Home Alone, which itself is like kind of referencing, like it's kind of lampshading the accidental surveillance that happens, because it explains that no one is really ever home alone. The lab scientists ask people through iNaturalist to collect photos and upload photos to a map, a point on a map, and then those photos will be capturing the kind of species that you might find in your home. But I think it's worth thinking about what it is that is interesting about appealing to us when looking at this stuff. So I'm not saying this is like just, I'm sure also the citizen scientists find this pleasurable. There's a kind of pleasure in searching on these points, not just because of the naturalist documentation, but also because it offers a sneak peek into the citizen scientists' homes. So if you want to go to the next slide, when I click onto a town that neighbors mine, I can see that a person trapped a mouse under a Tupperware while another chased a mouse through the snow. As the mouse scampers across the snow, it's accompanied by footprints of a human, as if the viewer chases both human and non-human specimens. So this is a kind of accidental surveillance that reveals the disparity between the lab scientists and citizen scientists, despite the acts of care and despite the revised IRBs and the crowdsourced personalities. So I just want us to think about how lab scientists uncover citizen scientists' lives as part of data collection without actually thinking about the potential problems and ramifications of what it means when it comes to surveilling citizen scientists who are not considered human subjects. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, hello everybody, and for today's talk I'm going to focus on the network of citizen science that developed after the Fukushima nuclear disaster that happened in Japan in 2011. So next slide, please. So following the release of a radioactive pollutant after this disaster, there was many members of the Japanese public that grew very concerned about the legitimacy of state experts, especially in their ability to control the risk of radiation. There were many reasons for this distrust, such as the inability to get precise data about contamination. And as a result of this problem, the population began to deal with the risk of radiation by mobilizing expert practice of their own, such as the one that you can see on the picture. And this was very much epitomized by the creation of Citizen Science Network, where citizens collectively monitored radiation in their environment. So next slide. So often these civic efforts were very much praised by scholars, and they were seen as resisting the normalizing forces of the states. So for instance, citizen science in post-Fukushima Japan was theorized as a renaissance of civil society in Japan, as representing independent safety channels, and also as being practices that circumvent the state's expertise. Next slide. But when I began my fieldwork in Japan in 2015, the situation was no longer as chaotic as it was. As you can see on the left picture, radiation had now become normalized through monitoring posts that displayed the level of contamination. And the Japanese state had also launched an official policy of revitalizations. And the government top priority was the socio-economic revitalizations of Fukushima. And it's during that time that I began to see a different facet of citizen science that was not happening within a context of emergency, but within a context of post-disaster recovery and repatriation to Fukushima. And as I watched some citizens working with their feet in radioactive mud, the kind of Janus phase of resistance and risk privatization that epitomized their work also became more apparent. And in that context, citizen science began to echo a different set of debates than just resistance. And this brought me to make different argumentations relating to participatory science. So I have summarized my argument under the term of conflictual collaboration, which describes how initial practices of resistance by non-state actors can also sometimes evolve in collaboration with official politics of state governance. And I want to argue that civic resources that are sometimes used to resist or reinterpret certain narrative of contamination can also very much at the same time reinforce the state-sponsored normalization of the disaster, as well as hegemonic understanding of radiation danger. And meanwhile, they also risk becoming crucial technique of neoliberal governance that are designed to govern the conduct of population amidst contaminated environment. So one of the first reasons that led to an instance of conflictual collaboration is linked with the production of raw and open data. So after the disaster, many citizens were dissatisfied with the state monitoring of radiation, which was perceived as not being precise enough. So this is a frustration that led, for instance, to do-it-yourself practice of monitoring, where citizens begin to produce data on contamination rather than waiting for the state. So for instance, devices like Geiger counter were some of the most popular instruments to produce an understanding of the scale of contamination. But once the data is produced, it also needs to be interpreted. And in this, there's a very important epistemological investment that is required from the citizen so as to understand what measurement actually means. And since all technologies and data have implicit biases and limitation, this interpretation can sometimes, not always, but sometimes be based on a partial understanding of the kind of risk that radiological devices actually measure. So for instance, a Geiger counter cannot measure certain risk associated with radiation exposure. And during my fieldwork, I noticed that certain citizens were not necessarily aware of these limitations, and they sometimes produce interpretations of risk that were very similar to the state narrative, who use the same kind of technologies to produce very optimistic claims of safety. It's also important to say that the interpretation of radiation risk is influenced by the fact that what we know and what we don't know about the extent of radiation danger has long been embedded in an important culture of propaganda that was shaped by the nuclear arm race of the Cold War. And this is also a legacy of misinformation that can sometimes be carried on by the work of citizen science. Lastly, the data is also sometimes made available freely to everybody on the internet. In this case, we talk about open data. And I've noticed that the Japanese government was also using the open data made available by some citizen scientists to reframe the discussion of radiation risk within their overall narrative of revitalizations. So here, practices of citizen science are not impervious to power plays, and they can also be mobilized by powerful agencies that have their own interests. The second reason that led to conflictual collaboration is found in similar visions of post-disaster recovery. So during my fieldwork, I did a lot of research with a citizen science that was born from a dissatisfaction with state monitoring. So the center, for instance, tested contamination in the soil where children played. And many of these potential dangers were not initially taken into account by state practices of monitoring. And in this, the center revealed worrisome level of contamination. So the network was able to produce data that sometimes very much contradicted the state narrative of safety. But at the same time, members did not use their work or their data to push for litigations like demands of evacuation. So when I asked the director why she was not using data for evacuation, she explained that anxiety about health hazard was only one of the many problems that the community faced, and that many people still very much love the region even after a disaster. So if data was used for evacuation demands, it will result in a fragmented community of people that had already faced many difficulties, like family separation, for instance. So here, civic practices of monitoring was used to rebuild trust in the village. It enabled people to better understand the scale and scope of contamination. So we can see that personal connections with both the data and the community explain the absence of litigation demands. So the consumptions of citizen-generated data was embedded in a network of social relationships and cultural identities that promoted a vision of recovery that very much collaborated the state's attempt to revitalize life in Fukushima. So specific vision of recovery share common ground with the state's attempt to reinstate life in Fukushima, even when the citizen science data ironically demonstrate a significant amount of contamination. So the last reason that led to an instance of conflictual collaboration is linked with neoliberal ideologies that promote social tropes of individual responsibility, self-empowerment, and risk management. And in Japan, I did some field work with a group of citizens that felt abandoned by the state. And they began to collaborate with actors in the nuclear domains that were promoting a philosophy of radiological protection known as low as reasonably achievable to help them face the uncertainty of contamination. But in this philosophy, it is the responsibility of the citizens to manage this risk. So making one dose as low as reasonably achievable become the task of the citizen, and sometimes almost a full-time job through constant testing, monitoring, and tracking of radiation. And during my fieldwork, I noticed that many citizens had begun to blame themselves rather than the state policy, for instance, saying things such as, I shouldn't have eaten these mushrooms because they're more prone to contamination, or I shouldn't go in forest areas because the level over there are higher. So while citizen science monitoring practices linked with this philosophy are very useful to lower the overall risk of exposure, they also at the same time impede alternative understanding of post-disaster recovery, notably permanent evacuation, because recovery in this philosophy of exposure is first and foremost understood as lying in the promotion of a tracking agenda within contaminated areas. So in a context of expertise, if in a context of crisis of expertise, this kind of radiation protection culture also provides the states or the corporate polluters an opportunity to bypass traditional forms of governance by notably shifting responsibility for ensuring safe living conditions onto the shoulder of citizens. So in the end, while citizen science can be very useful, I think that the growing impact of citizen science can also echo a neoliberal shift in the management of contamination, which can lead to reduced public expenditure, minimal government interventions, and also risk privatization, meaning that risk become a matter of personal business rather than the state's responsibility. So in the end, the danger, I argue, lies in the normalization of risk that produce societies in which citizens have to take care of themselves in increasingly polluted environment, while equally interpreting very partial and complex data about controversial environmental dangers. So thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. I want to thank Dr. Link and the American Philosophical Society for organizing this session. I also want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from unceded Seneca land and to acknowledge the history of genocide and ongoing colonization of Indigenous peoples that take place here. I also do want to mention, given the topic I'll be discussing, that I will be discussing ableism and oppression of disabled people, sometimes using examples. So citizen science makes bold claims about being accessible and for everyone. These quotes here are from real ongoing citizen science projects or platforms. And I'm in particular really interested in focusing on biodiversity citizen science projects and environmental ones in particular, because biodiversity is interested in the diversity of life. And despite these platitudes, citizen science projects focused on the diversity of life are often exclusive. There cannot be inclusion without disability accessibility. So today I'm going to be showing you an analysis of accessibility in environmental science citizen projects in the US, in part so there can be no disagreement that citizen science as it is now is inaccessible. And while I'm going to be sharing some evidence-based benchmarks, I want to point out that I'm not advocating a checklist-based approach to dealing with accessibility, and instead I'm suggesting that we can look to principles from feminist disability studies to work towards a more accessible and inclusive future for citizen science. So in terms of the data I'll be talking about today, I reanalyzed and then added additional analyses to a 2017 study that looked at 509 citizen science projects. And I subsetted that to look at 279 US-based environmental citizen science projects. And then did another analysis on the subset of those that are currently active. It was 140 of them, looking specifically at their websites and disability accessibility standards. Okay, so on this side of the next series of ones, I just want to point out to you the color scheme I'll be using here. Basically, yellow is accessible and gray is inaccessible. So you see this keep coming up, right? So on the previous side, it said citizen science wants to do all these things. The promise of citizen science, there's lots of it, but it's not achieving that currently. So citizen science projects, despite many of those being topically focused on the diversity of non-human life, are actually very restrictive in the requirements for participation based on particular sensory experiences. So of those 279 projects, almost 3/4 of them actually required vision to participate in the project. And that often went along with citing as a required method and or requiring photography as data submission. Just over 6% of them required hearing, so listening to something and then turning in the data to submit. And this big gray circle here is showing you that for a variety of other kinds of accessibility considerations, for example, having American Sign Language content, which deaf and hard of hearing participants may want to use, or having plain language summaries that people with intellectual or developmental disabilities may choose to use, or any information about having alternative data or sensory formats. None of them had any of that of those 279 projects. This is also true and an important consideration for the websites for citizen science projects, independent of the content of the project itself. So even though currently 5% of these projects are fully online, 75% of them require accessing something online to fully participate, often in terms of where you're submitting the data. So using a standard website accessibility evaluation tool, and with those 140 projects, what I'm showing you here in panel A is that almost 70% of projects were not meaningfully fully accessible to screen readers. And screen reader technology is commonly used by blind and low vision internet users, as well as some people with physical disabilities. Panel B here is showing you that almost half of websites did not have all high contrast images or website elements. The lighter yellow panels here had some of them. And panel C here is showing you that some of these sites did not have alt text to accompany images, so alternative text that can be useful to make the web content accessible. There's also a lack of information about accessibility generally. And so these three panels, what you're seeing here is that A is almost 90% of projects included no information for participants about accessibility at all in terms of was this mentioned anywhere. And the only ones that did were actually ones that were required to by laws, which I get into the paper and don't have time to today. And most of that actually came from them sharing information they were required to by state or federal statutes. Just one that was a private entity chose voluntarily to include that information. Panel B is showing that just under 10% provided contact information for someone. So was there actually someone to ask for information about? And then panel C is showing that only one citizen science project actually mentioned disability, right? So that tiny white sliver you can see there, and one other website mentioned all abilities, and the rest of those 140 mentioned it nowhere. So how did we get here? One of the things that I would argue is that citizen science is now the internet, right? So if 3/4 of these are requiring that you use the internet and their website to actually engage with the data or submit it, and that it's not just citizen science that's not accessible, the entire internet is not accessible. So the internet presents lots of opportunities, and I would argue it's one of the reasons citizen science has grown so much, but it's also an exclusionary space. And so in a US context, and all these projects I'm mentioning are based in the US, we've had the landmark Americans with Disabilities Act, and we also have additional state statutes to address anti-discrimination. And disability activists in part got this success based off of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and to use this framing to point out that people are disabled by social and infrastructural choices, the social model of disability. And so we can in part use legislation to fight some of those things. And yet, despite the ADA being in existence now for decades, the internet did not exist as we know it when the ADA was passed. And much of the legal debate since has been trying to suss out where the internet should fit into this debate. I will point out just this week, the 11th Circuit Court, Federal Circuit Court, ruled against website accessibility being part of the ADA. There's split court decisions, and this is an ongoing legal issue that changes day to day. This could be clarified by amending the ADA or through rulemaking, but the previous federal administration closed the rulemaking on web accessibility in 2017. Oh, next slide, yeah. So much of the debate has to do with who is considered a public accommodation. And so public accommodations under this statute fall into 12 specific categories. Many of them are sites that do host citizen science projects. So for example, of the ones that I looked at, a third were hosted by academic institutions, some were hosted by government, or places like museums, yet 40% were hosted by private nonprofits or commercial organizations, and they actually wouldn't fall into this. So even if the Department of Justice or Congress changed the ADA and included websites, those organizations would actually fall outside of it. And so this conflicting rulings has led to this patchwork right now in terms of where this is. So this legal historical context in the US explains in part why the internet is not accessible, and then why citizen science websites may not be accessible. But I want to point out that right after the internet was created, the World Wide Web Consortium also created the Web Accessibility Initiative. So we have what's known as the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is actually a benchmark for website accessibility. And so organizations don't need to wait for a legal minimum standard. They don't need to have compliance being enforced. Projects could be choosing voluntarily using these known evidence-based guidelines to make their websites accessible. So the fact that so many organizations and projects have inaccessible websites speaks to the challenge of dealing with a broader issue that forcing accommodation frameworks cannot solve. And so I would argue that a conceptual and values-based shift is needed in citizen science to actually actively welcome disabled people and fight ableism. And so feminist disability studies, which combines disability studies and feminist theory, can frame disability as a cultural issue and examine power and social dynamics rather than a medicalized deficit view based on people's bodies and abilities. And so we can use this framework to make citizen science more accessible. And so here I would argue that Wallace Craig, who is pictured here, and his life and work, and even his use of citizen science could be a real exemplar here. And so almost a century ago now, he was actually trained as an academic psychologist, and he focused on birds and birdsong. He started his career as an able-bodied scientist, and he became deaf in the transition period where he became an independent researcher and faculty member. So it didn't just change his career, it actually changed how he was able to study birds and bird songs. And so it was actually him being forced out of his faculty position when he became fully deaf that actually pushed him into citizen science. So in 1926, he actually placed an ad in Science magazine asking for volunteers to help him record wood pewee songs and transcribe them. He actually invented a way to work together with hearing citizen scientists so he could continue doing his research. And in part in the resulting monograph that he wrote, he used this citizen science data. So it was actually ableism and the lack of the formalized science that pushed him into citizen science as a more experimental space. And I want to illustrate that his life and work can point to several critical points. Number one, that disabled scientists can and have and do lead citizen science projects. So when we're talking about accessibility, it's not just for the participants, it's also about making space for the experts and the leaders here who are also formal scientists, not just participants. And also that discrimination and ableism severely impacted his career, and many citizen science projects in the environmental and biodiversity space are arguing that these are supposed to be pathways to science. And finally, his way of being and innovating as a disabled science is an example of what we would call disability gain or deaf gain. So it's not just that disabled people can be or are expected to mainstream into spaces, they actually bring benefits and innovation. And so in part, what Wallace Craig is known for is actually studying a bird who was a stuttering individual and considering the benefits that a bird with a disability would bring actually to its mating choices and to its ability to be in the world. And so this in part speaks to disability as method, changing the way in which we view the world and not assuming or prescribing that people must sense the world in particular ways in order to participate. So citizen science should be designed and carried out, assuming that participants and leaders are disabled. This is in part because people with disabilities are actually the largest minority in the world, and also because people's needs change over time. So one way of imagining and talking about able-bodied people is that you're all just temporarily able. Of status is important to think about beyond just considering the aging process. And so it's important to consider that imagining who the user community is or what the projects are should be accessible in a variety of ways. And yes, everyone should make their website accessible, potentially using a checklist, but what accessibility would look like for a citizen science project and community would be much broader. So one thing to keep in mind is that it involves flexibility and as an ongoing process. And so thinking back again to, do those projects have someone to reach out to or some way of sharing information about what that flexibility could look like, what that multimodality could look like? It just really strikes me that Wallace Craig wouldn't be welcome in the sorts of spaces that he was operating in a century ago. And that's in part based on those choices we're making about project requirements and platform requirements now 100 years later. I do want to end by mentioning some limits of access. So just because we could expand the pool of potential participants or leaders doesn't mean that anyone owes citizen science their data. So especially for environmental data that's used for large scale monitoring, there's a lot of moralizing that goes into claims of saying, we want everyone's data, we want you to participate. And I want to point out that especially for disabled people who are either undercompensated or uncompensated, citizen science may not be the space where they choose to be doing additional uncompensated labor. So it requires fighting ableism and discrimination in broader society in order to make these spaces more welcoming. And also that in part because Black and Indigenous and people of color are more likely to be disabled or perceived as disabled, in part due to actions by the state, it's important to make sure that ableism and fighting discrimination go hand in hand on a variety of fronts. You can't address accessibility without also addressing racism. And in part because I started by talking about that I'm on unceded land, I do want to end by pointing out that one of the tensions with addressing accessibility in projects is that access right now as a civil right is granted by a state institution, in my case, the United States, that is a colonizer of formerly indigenous lands. And so it's really important that citizen science interrogate its own role in ongoing and historic colonialism, and to point out that real access won't be achieved without fighting both racism and colonialism together. So thank you all.
That was great. Thank you, all three of you, so much for those really fantastic presentations. I'm moving my screen around because we have so many questions who have come in. And I've got my cheat sheet here of different things that came up. There's, several really interesting themes here, I think, that pull your work together. And I'll try to dovetail those with the questions that are here. Maybe the first one to sort of start off with is, what are the roles and responsibilities of citizen science organizers? And Maxime, I might ask you to kind of lead us off in thinking about that, because maybe in some ways the organizers of the citizen science project seem maybe the least explicit in your talk. I felt like you're sort of giving us the citizen scientists on the ground making the recordings, and then the government and its relation to that data. But was there an intermediary organization? Were there scientists in between those, sort of doing the larger direction? And what responsibility do they hold in the story that you tell? And then after that, I'd love to open up to Kaitlin and Darcie to think more broadly about what, should there be a sort of checklist, not really the word I want to use, but are there sort of rights and responsibilities for organizing institutions and if there is, does it need to be revised? Is it failing?
Yeah, so there were a lot of intermediary, for instance, scientists, between government and between citizen scientists, and really scientists coming from different backgrounds. So you had, for instance, very anti-nuclear scientists, or also sometimes very pro-nuclear scientists, and this also influenced, for instance, the direction of citizen science. Regarding the different roles, I think it's not my task as someone who's not living in Japan to say this should be the role of citizen scientists. That's really not my job to do. And there's a very different role, and we need to look at why the data is being used. Why are we seeing these projects? And some of these projects are very different. Some people love the region and they want to revitalize Fukushima throughout citizen science. Often, for instance, this is done by farmers who do not very much care about the health effects of radiation. They will probably die from old age before facing any kind of damage. But at the same time, this creates a lot of tension because they want to see their children, for instance, or their grandchildren, but the parents don't want to do so. So it creates much more tensions. At the same time, there's people that have used citizen science to evacuate, but this kind of citizen science has very much disappeared because people have gathered data and they interpret it as being dangerous and they've moved elsewhere. And now we're seeing two kinds of citizen science in Japan. One that was used to evacuate, that doesn't really exist that much anymore, and that has been very much criticized by the government. And we're also seeing another kind of citizen science for a different role, which is to revitalize the region. And this one is either being encouraged by the government or it's being kind of ignored. And once again, it's not my job to say this should be the role of citizen science. I think we, as academic or a scholar, we should just simply be critical in examining who or what gets empowered in certain citizen science projects. So for instance, in some case, well, it seems that it's often the nuclear lobby or the corporate polluters who are actually getting empowered in these kinds of projects. So this can happen at the same time as people try to carve independent or alternative space to pursue their life in the region that they love.
Kaitlin and Darcie, thoughts on the sort of broader question about sort of the responsibilities of those organizing units? Kaitlin, that looks like you're...
I was going to just say, I feel more comfortable in part because I intentionally limited my conversation to a US context saying, yes, there are things that we need to do. From a compliance standpoint, in part based on what kind of institution it is, yes, the host of a citizen science project does actually have responsibilities. And so again, I didn't get into all the legalistic stuff in this presentation today, but there are minimum requirements in terms of thinking about, is an institution acceptable? There are a lot of loopholes for that though. So I did want to point out when I was doing this review that it does appear that there are some organizations that may not be complying that are supposed to, but we don't need to look for compliance. And arguably compliance is a floor, right? And so nothing is stopping organizations from being much more considerate. And so I would just say, especially if we're thinking about a new project, right, that a platform choice and how you use a platform, which ones you choose and what protocols you choose, all of those things inscribe values right into them. And so just thinking about each of those as being a step in which you may be including people or excluding people. And a lot of that has to do with who do you imagine the participants to be and what do they need? And so being much more expansive about who we imagine the potential set of citizen scientists to be and how they might want to do things. So not conflating a way in which we want data with saying that that must be how people pay attention to the world or sense the world around them.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, in terms of my project, I think that partly what it shows is that the intermediary protocols for science is actually not, it has a lot of flaws in terms of how it can protect people, right? So the Human Subjects Committee is mainly for a very specific, usually like medical or psychiatric pharmaceutical design, RCT trial, a randomized control trial. And this is a problem in general when you have social science projects that seek qualitative methods where there's a kind of continuous need to rely on informed consent. There's also this kind of intimacy that, you know, that forms between the data collector and the data collectee, especially when you have a citizen scientist who technically is a data collector, right? They're not actually a human subject. So then how do you protect them is a whole different kind of revision to IRB protocols. And also just the fact that there is emotional labor on the fact of this for the lab scientists, right? So that's something that I also found where the lab scientists have to perform a kind of like caretaker role, which itself is a kind of burden upon them. And that kind of leaves a whole different kind of move in terms of thinking through what are the responsibilities and rights of the organizers, because there's also this other kind of give and take. That said, I still think there's a disparity in terms of like the data collection.
Great. I'm going to combine two questions here, Darcie, while we have you up. The first is, I think, a specific one. Is some of the excess data a result of what's happening during the pandemic, when people might be more isolated, more willing to share, more in need of a sort of broader, intimate relationship? And then a more general question is, what do we make sense? How do we make sense of intimacy, of the role that intimacy plays as a rationale for citizen science more generally? Thinking here about the role of community and encouraging participation, but perhaps there's another way we might think about it as an intimate versus a shared experience is, and this, we could go to the larger group, is citizen science itself predicated on intimate relationships?
So I think this is a good question about whether or not the pandemic itself inspired the intimacies and the excess data. I actually think that the study design, though, produces that excess data partly, and it did start before the pandemic. So the one thing that you find out as an ethnographer is that people really do like sharing, and then you end up with excess. The whole point is to try to collect that kind of information from your interlocutors, but this is not something that lab scientists are used to, right? Or necessarily used to. So that's the thing. To me, these are kinds of very common ethical questions that arise when it comes to collecting qualitative data on a social science project. But when you get lab scientists, you're trying to study genetic sequences or ecologies, and you end up having this kind of excess data. I would say that the pandemic probably helped inspire the online communities a bit more. So that is where some more surveillance comes in with these like Facebook social media groups. In terms of, sorry, the next question was about intimacies as shared as like an integral part of citizen scientists. I think that's true, but I think there's a kind of appeal in the voyeurism as well. So it's not just about the shared framework. I think that's a really optimistic perspective. I think part of what I think is funny about this project is that it's sourdough starters. So everyone thinks it's not intimate. It's like just a funny kind of cute thing. But to me, it's like, it's the anthropologist, as a job as an anthropologist, it's to point out the negative aspects of everything. But there's a kind of power dynamic going on that isn't revealed. And there's a kind of surveillance that occurs that people enjoy watching other people's like findings or other people's kinds of, the whole thing, and then there's also navel gazing, which I think is really kind of the whole joke with the belly button cultures that they do in your wildlife projects. It's like there is a kind of almost self-awareness in that kind of label.
Excellent, thank you. There's a question here for Maxime. I found the ways that you showed that citizen science could be co-opted by the state and serve its priorities fascinating. Is there something specific about radiation risk that makes the citizen science around it more easily manipulated by the state? For example, that it is invisible and requires technologies to see it.
Yes, we often talk about the invisibility of radiation, but I think there's also other contaminants that are invisible to the naked eyes for sure. I think the big problem regarding co-option is that so much of the way we have understood or research radiation hazard and harm was linked to a very important culture of secrecy, a culture of propaganda that happened after World War II, when there was this Cold War tensions. And in this historical context, very much often national security trumped over concern of individual hazards and things like this. So one way perhaps to try to fight this co-option will be, to put forward the work of historians, for instance, who are increasingly starting to delve into these issues. Another problem is that if you also want to interpret data, if you want to learn about it, well, you need to go often through the kind of locus that are monopolized by nuclear agencies, where without too much surprise, the interpretation is often it's not going to be too much of a hazard. Don't stress too much about it. There were never any really independent organizations to focus on hazards in regard to radiation protection.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to combine two questions here for Kaitlin. I think we'll probably all agree it's astounding what you've uncovered about the lack of accessibility in projects themselves. And this is maybe a sort of positive way to try to move forward. What are the most successful means of changing attitudes on accessibility? what would be a good way forward, specifically within citizen science projects, to start to turn the tide. What would your advice be for organizations that perhaps don't realize or that are willfully overlooking it?
I mean, I think I want to assume good intentions, that it's potentially people are not doing that on purpose, but are maybe not aware. And I think one is to make sure in part that the organizers themselves are a diverse group of people. And so part of what we get into the paper, right, is that there's this access intimacy that comes from understanding the barriers of inaccessibility or the barriers of gatekeeping. And so one, again, I would just suggest multimodality. Are there ways in which teams of people could collect data in different ways? Or, do you really need a photograph? And so I would argue, as a scientist by training, that we actually have lots of really cool quantitative tools that the argument that multimodality would not be rigorous is actually not true. We have lots of ways of synthesizing findings across a variety of ways of collecting data, and let's embrace that then. So for example, lots of big citizen science contributory projects already have to account for differences in observers based on things like their knowledge of the subject or how long they've been a contributor. And so we could also deal in similar ways with different ways of collecting data. That is not an impossibility. And so then it raises the question of why aren't we doing that? And so I think that part of that is just asking all of us to imagine that, is this something that we really need to stick to doing it this way? And the answer is probably not. And so I think to just be very open-minded about what that could look like. The other is not to be just prescriptive, so just ask people. And so one of my colleagues, Dr. Liz Hare, who is a blind geneticist, in part is advocated for, and it's something I've learned from her, is you should always be asking people who are not part of your project why they're not. So potentially you won't think there's an access problem because you only ask the current contributor pool and they're able to do it based on the norms and the community you've already set up. So you're missing the feedback of people who may want to participate, who cannot or don't feel comfortable. And so I think part of that is just broadly getting feedback from people who are not in the community to find out, what could we be doing to welcome you into our community? And you might find out things that you didn't even consider.
I think one of the takeaways that I scribbled down at the end, which I absolutely love that you shared with us, Kaitlin, is think of being able as a temporary condition, right? To really start to change folks' mindsets. Well, we are beyond the hour now. I want to thank all of our presenters for absolutely fantastic presentations. They are, of course, just a summary of much larger papers, which are available for download on the APS website. We have 15 questions here. I'm going to forward those to our presenters as well so that they get a chance to see the rest. And they will have an opportunity if they want to respond to those, and we'll put them up on our website. So virtual round of applause for wonderful work. Thank you so much. Please join us at 3 p.m. for the wrap up today. Darlene Cavalier of Arizona State University and SciStarter and Robert Hauser of the American Philosophical Society will be in conversation reflecting on all the wonderful themes that have come up into this week's conference. So thank you and see you all at 3.